This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of When Science Speaks. I'm Mark Bayer, and this episode is being brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, build relationships, and connect with the stakeholders who matter the most. It is so wonderful to have these storytelling gurus with us today. Douglas and Lisa Marie Hatcher are the co-founders of Communicate for Impact, a business storytelling training firm just north of New York City. Prior to co-founding their firm, Douglas led thought leadership and executive communications at MasterCard in Purchase, New York. And before MasterCard, he spent 2 decades in Washington, D.C., working on Capitol Hill in senior positions in both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Lisa Marie worked in various roles in both the public and private sectors as well. Those roles range from working for the Comptroller of the Army at the Pentagon to managing global accounts for American Express to growing sales for 2 pharmaceutical companies. I just have to say, guys, American Express and MasterCard at the same time. So congratulations for staying together through that experience.
Well,
we got it covered.
We're bipartisan, Mark.
Yeah, I feel like you're bipartisan.
Ooh,
Yeah,
that was bad. Come on.
So, guys, thank you so much, Douglas and Lisa Marie, for joining us here. It's wonderful to have you on the show. We've got lots of questions for you that draw upon your expertise across all this time in different sectors, in storytelling in ways that are engaging, accurate, and memorable. So thank you, Douglas and Lisa Marie, for being on the show.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. We're big fans of you and the show, so this is great.
Thanks. Well, let's start with this. You know, we have a lot of scientists, engineers, technical folks in our audience, and I'd love for you to start by talking a bit about storytelling and its relationship with science. So, you know, lots of talk about the need for storytelling, particularly when you're explaining complicated topics. But, you know, I'd really like for you to elaborate more specifically on what does storytelling have to do with science, and also what does science have to do with storytelling?
Great question, Mark. Look, in short, everything. Storytelling and science have everything to do with each other. Storytelling gets its power from science. Science relies on storytelling to have impact, something you know a lot about. Here's the thing. Now, why does storytelling need science? The things that make a story have impact, believe it or not, are chemical hormones released by the brain. So there's something called oxytocin that makes us feel empathy. There's something called cortisol that gets us to pay attention, especially if there's an emotionally charged event. And then there's something called dopamine. I think a lot of us have probably heard of dopamine. Dopamine makes us want resolution. It makes us want happiness. And so the epicenter of storytelling is the human brain. And the discipline that helps us understand and use storytelling is neuroscience. So these two things are inextricably linked. Now, that's just on the storytelling side. On the science side, you know, if science is so powerful, why does it need storytelling? Let's start with facts and figures. We all know facts and figures are important, especially in a discipline like science. Here's what happens. Facts and figures activate 2 regions of the brain, but storytelling activates up to 7 regions of the brain. And those chemical hormones I just talked about, something has to cause them to be released, and that something is a story.
I love it. I love how you're sort of speaking the language of science when answering the question about science and storytelling, and making it really clear why, particularly those emotional aspects, are so key and so powerful. You also alluded to this, Douglas, but I'd like for both of you to chime in about data, the importance of data, accurate facts, evidence. I know that sounds quaint sometimes these days. It shouldn't, but it does. What about data? Is there room for storytelling in the world of data and analytics, which is the world that, scientists inhabit?
Yeah, well, I'll take that one.
Great.
We often hear the phrase that the data speaks for itself. And I'm going to show you why that's not necessarily true. Numbers need a narrator, and numbers need a narrator to provide context and meaning. So let's, for example, take the following number, 525600. 525600. It's a big number. But in the Broadway musical Rent, that number takes on an even bigger meaning. And as the song reminds us, 525,600 is the number of minutes in a given year. So what happens when you think of a year in terms of the total number of minutes? What effect does that have on you, Mark?
It just makes it more real and concrete and maybe comprehensible.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that every minute counts. And then especially when you set those minutes or that number to music, it takes everything to a whole new level. So once you hear the song 525,600 minutes, right? It just really transforms you, and it's memorable,
right? And
it kind of evokes something that makes you want to answer a call to action. And so that's why it's so important to use storytelling with numbers and with data, because that's usually what you want to do. Even if you're a scientist, you're often wanting to present information to get people to respond to your call to action.
Numbers need a narrator. I love that, Lisa Marie. It's so good. Wonderful. We should all remember that. I mean, of course, it's so memorable.
Yeah.
You're using one of my favorite rhetorical devices, alliteration. I don't know why my mind works in that way, but it often does. That's just great. Numbers need a narrator. Now, what makes a good story? Sometimes I get frustrated because I do hear, and we all, all of us hear about, well, the importance of telling a good story. And, you need to use storytelling in describing your science, for example, or complicated topics. And you've talked about why that is true. But what actually makes a good story? What are the elements in the structure that all good stories have?
Into this space, Mark, in the very beginning, the business storytelling space, is so often we'll hear people sort of bandy about the word storytelling, and they'll offer some thoughts that are legitimate, but they're kind of like platitudes. Like storytelling helps us connect with each other. Storytelling helps evoke emotion. All that stuff's true. But tell me how do I do it? And that's what we've really tried to work on the last couple of years. And we're getting close. I think we might even be there. But let's talk about structure, because that's the key. And to do that, you have to go back to a guy named Aristotle. Aristotle was the one. He did not invent a beginning, a middle, and an end, but he codified it. He wrote it down. So I'm going to say he basically started it. But that's the key. And it sounds so simple, but it's something you have to have. You have to have a beginning, you have to have a middle, and you have to have an end. Now let's talk about what each one of these things does. When you start out, you got to have a setting. You have to have some kind of context, something Lisa Marie just mentioned. You've got to have a setup. That's the beginning. But then something has to happen that disrupts the setting that you've just described. And there's a tension that comes from all of that. That's the middle. But then it's human nature to want that tension resolved. We do it in prose in writing. We do it in music. We want resolution. That's the end. There's more to it, but that's the basic scaffolding that helps you build a story.
I love that, Douglas. What I sort of take away from that is this tension, but also the resolution. And, you referred to music. I think that's really interesting. First of all, often there is a connection between people who are involved in science and also involved in music. The NIH director, Francis Collins, for example, is a great guitar player. I've heard him play.
Wow.
And of course, he's not the only one. I'm sure many of our listeners have aptitudes in other arts. Of course, the word scientist does include the artist. That's the etymology, as a word nerd that I am. But I guess what I wanted to say is I recently took up guitar about a year and a half ago, before the pandemic, for a big birthday. And a lot of the stanzas or verses, if you will, when you're playing acoustic guitar, for example, end with a D note, a D chord, D major chord. And that is just about this resolution. And then you start another riff or something like that, another series of chords. But I love how you made that connection to music in addition to the verbal kind of, things that we've been discussing with respect to storytelling.
Very, very cool. I have to jump in here. Just about your point, Mark. Number one, jazz, not to get all Ken Burns on everybody, but jazz is such a great example because you start out with what is called the head. That is sort of your opening statement. That's the setting. And then people will work off of the head and they'll have solos. That's the middle where there is a disruption. You have a melody that you're working off of, but it's going to be different. And then guess what? At the end, you come back to the head, and that's the resolution. I love that you're playing guitar. We'll have to talk offline about that. I was a guitar player wannabe for a long time. I studied with some guys in the DC area. We'll hit on this a little bit later, but when we think about music and songwriting, there are different ways to do it. And you can have songwriting that's AAA, and Bob Dylan did a lot of that early on, without a bridge, without a middle eight. But from the standpoint of what we're talking about, it's really great to have AA, the middle eight, and then a solo that sort of disrupts it, and then it comes back to the A, to the regular stanza. So there's a lot. You're right. There's a lot to work with here. I'm going to be quiet and let you keep going.
No, this is all wonderful, both of you. Thank you so much. And that being said, talking about the structure, it's not necessarily easy to put together a compelling story. And there are some landmines that are out there that I'm sure you both have observed. So I'd love for you to share with us sort of what are some of the common missteps that people make in telling stories.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest mistake people make is casting themselves as the hero of the story that they're telling. If you're trying to persuade someone to do something using storytelling, you need to cast your audience as the hero and make yourself the mentor. So your audience is Luke Skywalker and you're Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah.
And making your audience the focus changes everything. And since so many people miss this mark, it can be a huge competitive advantage in your marketing and communications if you're telling stories well and you're using structure to tell your stories. So it's always really good when you're telling a story to get in the habit of asking yourself, who's my audience? Why should they care? And what do I want them to do? And when you've answered those questions, it really helps you structure your story properly.
Lisa Marie, that's really helpful. And I'm wondering if you could just think of just a snippet of an example, one versus the other, sort of like, here's a sentence where I'm the hero, and here's a sentence where the audience is the hero, about the same kind of topic. So people maybe could see more specifically what they should and shouldn't do. It's funny. Sometimes I listen to somebody and I say, yeah, he seems to be the hero in all his stories. And I don't always say, that's not that's not usually a positive thing, at least not for all the stories. But I'm wondering, just to give, a sentence that makes that contrast, clear.
Yeah. Douglas has a really good example of getting off track, because we do that sometimes. We're talking and we kind of, everyone knows someone that just kind of goes on and on and on, and you're kind of like, what does this have to do with me? Why do I care? Just be quiet. Anyway, Douglas has a really good example of kind of veering off track and then correcting course and getting back on track. So why don't you share that, Douglas?
Sure, great.
Yeah, that's good. But let me back it up one second to what Mark's point was. Mark, I'm going to really simplify this and say one of the best ways to make yourself the hero, which you don't want to do, is to use the pronoun I.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you should not use the word I, but if every sentence begins with I, that is kind of a problem. You've got to mix it up with the word you. You is an extremely powerful word. And so that's really one of the easiest and best ways to make sure that you're making your audience the hero and not yourself. I'll give you a great example. This is an extreme example. Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. You will not find the word I in that 286-word document anywhere, because Lincoln was focused solely, exclusively on the country and the stakes. He doesn't use the word I.
Yeah.
That's a great example, and also a very, very helpful quick check for all of us to make sure that we are really focused where we need to be, which is on the audience, as Lisa Marie was saying. Just great stuff. And taking off from that point, sometimes, particularly when you're in person and you're telling a story, you can recognize that you're veering off course. You're losing your audience, and you see that because you see people zoning out. You see people on their phones. Now, this is more of a challenge virtually, but nonetheless, I'd love for you to talk about when we may see or may feel or sense that we are veering off course, how we can course correct, how we can get back on track really in telling a compelling story.
Well, again, another great question. Wow, there are a couple of things. I mean, look, one thing is if you're not making eye contact with your audience, if there's no energy between you and the audience, that is a problem. If someone's looking at their watch, that is a problem. There are lots of telltale signs that you are going in a bad direction. Let me give you an example. This is one that we use in our storytelling course, and it involves an old pair of running shoes. And I'm going to read you the example with the veer off, and then we're going to talk about how I rectified it.
So great. Yeah, please.
Okay, here it is. I realized these running shoes are ratty and worn out. Now, at this point, normally I would skip to a different sentence, but I'm going to veer off. I'm going to say, I realize these running shoes are ratty and worn out. I wash them every couple of years. I don't wash them more often than that because I don't want them to fall apart. These are my favorite pair of shoes. I remember buying them when the Nike campaign, Just Do It, came out. I can't count the number of times I've been tempted to throw them away. Now, all of that information is interesting, but it's really not necessary because this is how I would do it without the veer off. And I'm going to give you one word that will save you every time. So let me start again, and then we'll get to that one word. I realize these running shoes are ratty and worn out, but that's probably the most important word in storytelling. You don't literally always have to use the word but you've got to signal a turn. But these are the shoes I wore when I ran my first marathon, when no one thought I could do it. So I keep them to remind me that I can do anything I put my mind to, no matter the odds.
Yeah, the pivot, and also, of course, the emotion, and seeing yourself in that story. So often we're told, or we feel that people are saying, that's just not possible. You can't do this. So it releases some of those, or activates maybe, as well as releases, it activates other areas of the brain through this emotion that we were talking about before. And it's a really interesting story. And that tension that you both spoke about as well is there too.
Excellent. And here's the thing. You don't want to rush the pivot or the turn, but the sooner you get there, the better. And in this case, all the words that came before the but, except the opening statement, weren't necessary. Mm-hmm. And the structure that I used is a structure that we use in our course. We call them story hacks. They're short narrative structures that basically will get you out of any jam that you're in terms of communications. But I'd like to walk you through that for just a second, if that's please. Okay.
Absolutely.
So in this example with the shoes, and I'm talking about something called and, but, therefore. The and is the setup. The but is the turn. The therefore is the resolution or the consequence. And so the and is, I realize these shoes are ratty and worn out. The but is, these are the shoes that I wore my first marathon. And then the therefore is, or the so, or that's why I keep them, to remind me I can do anything. That is a story in a nutshell. It has the turn and it has the causality that you have to have in a story, where this affects this and this goes to that, but this happened and then therefore this happened.
Yeah, really, really nice and very clear for all of us as we think about how to tell a compelling story that's efficient and engaging and memorable and so visual, as you're describing it.
And the person who is really the apostle or the champion for this is a guy named Randy Olson. Mm-hmm. Randy Olson is a scientist. You might have known him or heard of him.
Sure,
He's a scientist turned filmmaker. Well, he didn't invent and but therefore, but he is the great, evangelist for it. The funny thing is, and I don't want to go on a huge tangent, but I have to tell you this. Mm-hmm. The people who inspired Randy Olson, you're never going to believe who inspired him to work off of and but therefore. Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park.
Well, how did that
seriously
happen?
They talk about this in at least one video, and they say, this is what we do in our writer's room. We've got markers and whiteboards and all this stuff, and we have an idea. And we say, this happened and this happened and this. Oh, no. We have to say this happened, but this happened, therefore this happened. If you go into this and this happened and that happened and this happened, you're going down this kind of rabbit hole that nobody wants to follow you on. You have to replace ands with buts or therefores to keep the beats going. And these guys are the ones who really kind of started talking about this, and Randy Olson picked up on it, and he's really made a big framework out of it.
Yeah, and the great thing about the and but therefore story structure is it can be as simple as 3 sentences. That could be your elevator pitch or something very short and simple. Mm-hmm. But if you have something longer that you're creating, you just repeat that formula, and but therefore. Maybe each paragraph has an and but therefore. And that's what really keeps your story interesting and keeps people engaged.
Wonderful. And I can tell you, in working closely with scientists, that there is a tendency, and we all feel this regardless of our profession. We've done something important, we want to talk about it. And the tendency is to talk about process steps. I did this and then I did that. These are all these interim things that happened before you get to the result. The problem is that the only people who are really interested in those process steps are the speaker and maybe the speaker's parents. I don't know. They're so proud. But oftentimes, of course, there are colleagues who are interested in that, maybe had a role to play in it. But for the most part, there's this feeling or this attraction to, I did this, it was meaningful to me, and I want to talk about it, but it doesn't serve the audience. And that's such an important, test or threshold question to ask yourself is, does this really serve the audience?
Exactly. And let's say you're looking for funding, Mark, for a project or additional funding. You've got to make those people hearing you walk them through your research, you have to make them care. That's really, really, I mean, the facts and the figures and the data and the evidence, all very important, but you have to make them care. I don't want to monopolize, but I got to give you one more example. And I did this today just to kind of prove it to myself. Taking a cue from Matt Stone and Trey Parker, I wrote, we were walking down the street and nope. We were walking down the street, but that's all I wrote. And then I finished it I had no idea where this was going to go. We were walking down the street, but a dog was following us. So we sped up, but the dog sped up too. So we turned around, we turned down another street. That's why we were late to the bridal shower. We had to take a detour. We're glad we did, because on the news that night, we heard that a coyote was roaming our neighborhood.
It just, when you use the word but, it just takes you down a path. It just takes you down a creative path that you wouldn't think of to go down without that. I mean, it really changes everything. So if your listeners out there are struggling with captivating their audience, making that connection, and they're sitting down and they need to write something, write your opening statement, whatever it is you want to talk about, and then put but, and it will just open up your mind to so much, and you can't help but come away with an interesting story. And,
that's so true. And I think it also signals to the audience that something's going to happen, something different.
It puts you on alert, right? Your ears perk up.
Yeah. It's, it's sort of like whatever it is, but, and then if you pause, well, people are like, but what? I want to know. Wonderful, wonderful. I want to ask if in all your experience and your real focus in this area, which is fantastic, love it, are some people just naturally better at telling stories than other people?
I think we're all fantastic storytellers naturally. We all tell stories beautifully, naturally. In other words, if you're at a barbecue and you want to tell your friend something that happened that day, you're probably going to tell a really good story. If you're sitting at a bar and you have a beer in your hand and someone comes up to you, you haven't seen in a while, you're probably going to share a really good story. Where it breaks down is when you have to communicate for your job. Because even the things that are most familiar to us, for whatever reason, when it comes to trying to explain that once you're in the office or your laboratory or whatever, in a business sense, for whatever reason, our minds just kind of shut down and we don't know how to tell a story properly. So, we gossip beautifully, naturally, right? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of buts and turns and wonderful, things that happen that are surprising when we're gossiping. Or if you're talking about a fabulous sport event that was exciting, there's going to be an and but therefore in there, and that's going to be exciting. But if you're talking about, whatever you're working on at work, people get stuck and they feel like they're under pressure and just, they get writer's block, or they're just not really sure how to do it. And that's why it's so important to apply a structure to your storytelling that's no fail. It works every single time. So that's all it takes is just a simple structure. And once you know that simple structure, and we shared and but therefore today, that's one of 3 structures that we teach, it really helps you hit the mark.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just great to, of course, it lowers your anxiety level to know, okay, I've got this structure.
It
And,
takes the pressure off,
you know,
totally takes the pressure off.
yeah. And then you relax, and I'm sure there are chemicals, maybe not as much cortisol in your blood, and that enable this kind of natural ability that Lisa Marie just referenced to really come forward, even when you're at the office and you can't be drinking a beer or something like that at that point. Wonderful stuff. So, as we wrap up here, and we have so many things that we continue to talk about, this has been a fantastic interview. Thank you both, Lisa Marie and Douglas. You wrote this amazing book, and I would love for you to tell listeners about it.
Sure. Well, the book is called Win with Decency: How to Use Your Better Angels for Better Business. And we take 5 qualities generally associated with being a good person, and we show you how they can be transformed into skills that create competitive advantage. And the qualities that we talk about in the book are humility, empathy, vulnerability, gratitude, and generosity. And the book is rooted in storytelling. In fact, it was our experience in the storytelling space that really inspired the book. And the thought process that really got the ball rolling, I should say, is that you need humility to put your audience first. And we talked about that earlier, right? About making your audience the hero. You need that humility. And you also need empathy to understand the pain points or the challenges that are facing your customer or your audience or your funder if you're seeking funds. And you need vulnerability to connect with them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you overshare when maybe you're pitching, but it does mean that you have to confront some sort of problem that your audience is experiencing, or your audience just won't care about it.
I just love this so much, particularly right now. We're talking in the beginning of August of 2021, and employers are trying to figure out what's going to happen as far as having employees come back to work after a year and a half or so, some kind of hybrid workforce. These qualities are just so important for retention of employees and for a productive workforce. And it's just great to have you highlighting them. And like I said earlier in the show, we'll have information about where listeners can go to learn more about the book, where they can go to purchase the book, for example, because these are all qualities that are just so important always, I guess I would say. But I like how you're framing it as well as, it's sort of like being a good person is also good for business. And okay, well, that's a catchy line, but how do you do it in a business environment? And so to have that information in this book is really invaluable. I'm looking forward to reading it as well. And these qualities and how they can be oriented in a business and in your personal life too. These are all good things to be. So this has just been a wonderful interview. It's been specific. It's been actionable. It's been taking sort of buzzwords that people hear a lot, but may not know really how to translate into their day-to-day. There was one thing, Lisa Marie, you said as part of this last response that I wanted to highlight for people. You were talking about vulnerability, not oversharing, but vulnerability. And so when I talk to people involved in venture capital, people who are investors, people who are hearing all these pitches all the time, and I ask them, like, what makes an effective pitch? And one of the things that they say is, it's not necessarily the presentation. It's usually the Q&A. And what is it during the Q&A that makes it important, or the presentation? What makes a pitch really stand out? And what I hear is it is acknowledging preemptively, putting out there the fact that maybe this idea is gonna, it's gonna face some obstacles. There are risks associated with investing here. And we know that there are challenges that we're going to confront, and that has to show, you have to show some, I guess, realism, but also as part of that, it's vulnerability, like you say, and it just ties into the storytelling nature of it, but also as you're describing your book and the application of these different qualities like vulnerability in a business context, that kind of the vulnerability aspect is one that I hear that's usually lacking in these pitches, say, for funding and for investing.
Mark, you just made me think. I just got a image in my mind. I've seen a lot of Shark Tank episodes where the pitchers come out, right, and they've worked really hard and memorized this pitch, and sometimes they get a no, but then when they start, as you said, but then when the sharks start questioning them, and they're free to respond off the cuff, and they start sharing a story naturally instead of what they've canned for their pitch, that's when they become vulnerable. That's when they maybe really expose something that evokes emotion among the sharks and turns those sharks to say yes. I've seen that happen so many times because it's when they get real and that vulnerability is exposed that the sharks go, oh, okay, I get it now.
That's a great point. But part of the challenge and where we come in is don't wait for the Q&A.
Yeah.
Get your pitch right.
Yeah.
Be real, as it were, in the context of your pitch, and do these things. Be vulnerable. Have a real story arc that is a beginning, middle, and an end, and nail it right from the start.
Yeah, just great. Douglas, Lisa Marie Hatcher, this has been a really instructive, entertaining, and specific and actionable interview. And I thank you so much for sharing your expertise with listeners of the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We had a blast.
And listeners, thanks so much for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.